Sometimes a wrestler will rise to the top, and it seems like it was destined to be. Scenes like Stone Cold winning his first world title at WrestleMania 14, Kofimania running wild at WrestleMania 35, or Cody Rhodes finishing the story come to mind. But not everyone with such potential gets to have their big moment in the end. No, some, for one reason or another, flame out before this can occur. But who are the most notable examples of wrestlers that left us thinking, what if? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Brody Lee. What a punch in the gut this one was, because after spending so many years in WWE doing great work as part of the Wyatt family, Lee had only recently signed a deal with AEW, where it looked like he was on his way to the top as a singles star, and maybe even get a run with the world title. Sure, his debut on AEW TV might have happened the week the worldwide shutdown began, and so he didn't get to have that big debut appearance in front of a crowd which he deserved. But even if this was the case, he was still quickly rising up the ranks there and was bound to get his big break eventually. In fact, so high was he rising that after only a few months on the roster, he'd already be beating Cody Rhodes to become the second ever TNT champion. But as we all know now, this would in many ways be his last hurrah, as after dropping that belt back to the American Nightmare in a fantastic dog collar match on the October 7th, 2020 episode of Dynamite, the leader of the Dark Order would fall ill, with him later tragically passing away on December 26th of that same year. How high could Brody have gone if his illness hadn't befallen him? All the way to the top. Yeah, we really could have seen a situation where, as fans came back to arenas, the Exalted One continued to grow in power as a heel force and even became world champion at some point. Yes, Brody really did have the potential to be a top star, the same of which can be said about our next subject, that being Magnum TA. That's right, perhaps the most notable case of a what-if to come out of the territory days. Back in the early 80s, Magnum TA felt like he was poised to become the next big breakout star of Jim Crockett Promotions. But then why wouldn't he? Because here was someone who really had it all. The look, the charisma, and the in-ring skill. Hell, there's a reason people call his steel cage match against Tully Blanchard at Starrcade 1985 the greatest cage match of all time, and that's because he was that great. And there's also a reason Magnum spent so much time as the NWA United States heavyweight champion around then too, with that reason being it was clear he was being positioned as the future heir to the throne of Dusty Rhodes. In fact, it was generally accepted by everyone involved in the industry during the mid-80s that it was only a matter of time until the Virginian beat Ric Flair for the big gold belt. And after that, it would have truly been off to the races for Magnum, as he would have no doubt become a huge star, perhaps the only man who could have challenged Hulk Hogan's reign of dominance in the WWF. Seriously, had things not gone the way they did, we could have been talking about a very different wrestling landscape. As while the Hulkster was always going to appeal to the younger audience more, his NWA counterpart may have drawn even more adult fans to the show. Sadly though, before Magnum could rise to the top of the mountain, a serious car accident in October of 1986 would bring an abrupt end to his career as it left him with a broken back. Obviously then, with this back injury being severe enough to leave the young up-and-comer paralyzed for a period of time, it meant there was no way he was ever going to be able to step in the ring again. And because of that, the dream of him ever reaching his full potential was over. But Magnum TA wasn't the only territorial wrestler who ended up flaming out before his time, because earlier that very same year, a similar fate would await our next subject, Gino Hernandez. Yes, back during the 70s and 80s, Gino Hernandez was one of the fastest rising stars of Fritz von Erich's World-Class Championship Wrestling. And the reason he was shooting up the ranks so quickly back then was because, like with Magnum TA over in the Carolinas, he had all the tools required to be a top guy. It doesn't matter what element we're talking about, it was there in Gino in spades. And it's for that reason that come the mid-80s, he was working major programs against the likes of Chris Adams and the Von Erich brothers. Unfortunately though, right at the point where it looked like the Texan was about to reach that next level again, and perhaps even become world champion, tragedy would strike when he was found dead in his home on February 4th, 1986. How had he passed away? Well, the official ruling to this was a drug overdose. That said, even to this day, there are many who believe there was more to the situation and suggest there was foul play involved. Whatever the truth of the matter though, the reality remains the same, and that reality is this up-and-coming superstar in waiting was gone from the world at just 28 years old. So because of that, not only did he not get to do all things he could have done, but we never got to see him go down this path of success. Could the fate of WCCW have been different if Gino had never passed? It's possible things would have been better for a while, but sadly, as there were so many tragedies happening there, it's likely the fall would have come sooner or later. And one of those tragedies is our next subject as it happens, because just 2 years prior to the death of Gino Hernandez, a loss which hit even closer to home from Fitz Von Erich would occur when David Von Erich passed away. That's right, if you've seen The Iron Claw, then you'll already be aware of the Shakespearean tragedy that is the Von Erich family. 6 brothers, one of whom passed away as a child, and 4 of whom passed away while in their 20s and 30s. But while the passing of Kerry, Mike, and Chris are all no doubt tragedies in their own rights, there isn't that same sense of what could have been with them, as in the former's part, he got to win the NWA World's title, and in the latter two's part, well, they had solid careers in their own right as well. When it comes to David Von Erich though, he was always seen as the golden child. In fact, when all the brothers who lived into adulthood were growing up together, it was clear to everyone that David was the one who was going to be pushed as the top star. And that was a path he seemed to be going down nicely as the early 80s rolled around and he started getting into feuds with the likes of Jimmy Garvin, the Fabulous Freebirds, and the NWA World's Champion, Ric Flair. Really, it seemed like it was only a matter of time before his father Fritz Von Erich was able to convince the NWA booking committee to give his son a run with the world title, and at that point, he truly would have been a made man. But before this could happen, fate would decide it had other plans for David, as it was well on a tour of Japan in February 1984 that he'd pass away in a hotel room, with it later being ruled to have come about after his intestine ruptured. Yes, this one was yet another tragedy for the family, as he was gone far too soon. And because he passed on so young, he was never able to reach his full potential and become NWA World's Champion. But let's move away from the territory days for now, and on to something more recent, as it's in Attitude Era WWF, a decade or so after this, that we find our next subject, a man who could have been so much bigger than he was, Ken Shamrock. Come on now, we're talking about a guy who was one of the real toughest men in the world back during the 90s. Hell, he was one of the early stars of UFC. So there's no reason that when Ken Shamrock joined WWF in 1997, he shouldn't have been treated like a top guy. Unfortunately though, Vince McMahon hadn't quite figured out how to book a mixed martial artist yet. No, we were still several years away from the run Brock Lesnar would go on at the top of the card. Why didn't the boss know how to book Shamrock like an unbeatable final boss back then? Well, it was during the early days of MMA, and UFC hadn't quite taken off like it's since taken off today. So it wasn't as obvious to most casual fans watching that Ken would have pummeled absolutely anyone he was in the ring with if he was in a real fight with them. Then of course there's the fact that in Attitude Era WWF, the roster was so stacked with star power it was hard for anyone to get to the top of the card ahead of names like Steve Austin, The Rock, Mick Foley, Triple H, and The Undertaker. Even if you were someone so tough you could have easily won any given match you were in if you wanted to. No, the reality is that today, almost 3 decades on, Ken Shamrock stands as a what-if, with him being more of a prototype for what would later come. Should he have been more himself? Probably, in hindsight. But it's not as if his time in wrestling was completely wasted, because after leaving WWF behind in 1999, he would have nice runs for himself in places like TNA and New Japan. And what's more, he'd also eventually make his return to an MMA cage as well. But what about another star of the 90s? Someone whose skills lay more in his character work than his shoot fighting. Surely he deserves a spot in today's video given his time was cut so short, right? Well, yes he does. And that's why our next subject is none other than Brian Pillman. Seriously, the fact that Brian Pillman never lived long enough to become the absolute megastar he would have no doubt become during the Attitude Era is one of wrestling's greatest tragedies, as if we're being honest, he was laying a lot of the groundwork for what that era would be before it ever happened. Just go back and watch some of his loose cannon segments back in 1997, and you'll see exactly what we'd be seeing all over the show a year or two later. Segments like him stealing Goldust's wife away, or his famous segment with Steve Austin at his home. But then it wasn't just the work-shoot madman character that Pillman portrayed during his latter days which made him so great. No, there was also the fact that prior to his ankle injury at least, he was one of the best young high-flying wrestlers out there. Yes, while he didn't originate the style, he was one of the first to prominently use it in North America. So he can be seen as an inspiration for many who do it today. Just imagine then if he could have carried on going like this into the 2000s and beyond. How much fun would it have been to see him tear it up with a Kurt Angle or an Eddie Guerrero on a regular basis? That said, for as fun as this would have been, Brian Pillman's real legacy will always be that loose cannon character, the one which influenced so much about the industry as we know it today. It's this part of his body of work which represented the biggest what if, because he didn't even need to wrestle in order to utilize this skill set. No, he could have still been going strong today as a manager or commentator. But what about our next subject? That being Rick Boogs. That's right, while Boogs might have never reached the heights as some of the other names on today's list, he certainly had a lot of potential to be a top guy if all the stars had aligned for him. Why did things never work out for him? Well, after an impressive early run as a collegiate wrestler, Boogs was signed on the dotted line with WWE in 2017, and from there starts slowly making his way up the ranks from NXT to the main roster, with everything looking rosy for him at first. The only problem with this ascendance, though, was that it wasn't destined to last, because in September of 2023, not long after returning from a quad injury, he'd be cut from his contract, with the reason for this seemingly being Triple H didn't have a place for him in this new era of WWE. No, it seems the truth is that Rick Boogs was always more of a Vince McMahon project, someone who leaned far more into the comedy side of things, what with his 80s style guitar riffs he used to play Shinsuke Nakamura out to the ring during their brief alliance, and the outrageous mustache he sported. Where could he have gone if he stayed in WWE? Well, we don't think he would have been dethroning Cody Rhodes or anything. If he'd stayed around for long enough and switched his character up, he could have been a main event player in the future, one which might have kept him in the company for a long time. Or who knows, maybe he could have even remained as a comedy act and succeeded like R-Truth in Santino Marella. But as it stands today, Boogs seems to have retired from in-ring action entirely, meaning he'll never get a chance to meet any potential he had. But let's move away from the men for a moment and on to the women instead, as it's there we find our next great case of a what-if in wrestling, the case of AJ Lee. Yes, we know AJ did a lot during her career in WWE. Honestly, during that crossover period from the Divas era to the modern era, she was probably the face of the division, or was at least in a 1A and 1B situation with Paige. But while she might have had a lot of success between 2011 and 2015, even winning the Divas title on 3 separate occasions, Lee could have done so much more had her career not ended abruptly right in the middle of it. What caused her to call it a day at this point? Well, with that being the time of her husband, CM Punk's exit from the company, it must have been difficult for her to be caught up in the middle of things. And given she already had a ton of injuries wearing her down, she decided this was as good a time as any to hang up her boots once and for all. What a tragedy that was then, because had AJ hung around for just a year or two longer, she would have been in a prime spot as an experienced performer of the division right at the point the 4 horsewomen were rising to prominence. And this means we would have no doubt gotten some main roster clashes between her and Bayley and Becky, Sasha, and Charlotte. Hell, she could have even still been around to go up against Bianca Belair or Rhea Ripley when they debuted. Really, what we're saying here is that the WWE Women's Division seriously missed out by having AJ retire at just 28 years old. Sure, there's always the chance she could return at some point down the line, something her husband has occasionally teased. But even if she did come back at this point, it likely wouldn't be for a full-time run again. No, we'd probably be talking about a Royal Rumble appearance or a part-time run. And AJ Lee isn't the only person from the PG era of WWE who we can't see returning there full-time again anytime soon, as the same could be said for our next subject, Alex Riley. Yes, Alex Riley really did have the potential to make it to the top in WWE, and had a lot more to offer than he was given a chance to show during his time spent in the promotion between 2010 and 2013. Unfortunately, though, his run ended up being so inconsequential, many today have forgotten he was ever there at all. Yes, sadly, his most memorable moments from the era were his brief alliance with The Miz and the time he feuded with Dolph Ziggler over the United States title. But it could have been so much more if the opportunities were there, because the Virginia native did have something to him in that he had a boatload of charisma, could put on a solid match, and had a great look. Just look at the work he did in NXT before he made it to the main roster, and it's easy to see that he was a natural on the mic. So what happened to stop him going any higher then? Well, if rumor is to be believed, John Cena is the one that stopped him. That's right, as the backstage rumor at the time went, after doing something to upset Big Match John behind the scenes, Riley suddenly found himself falling lower and lower down the pecking order until he was barely even being booked at all. So it just goes to show, sometimes upsetting the top star in the company can be a negative to someone's career, even if it really shouldn't be. And it also goes to show that no matter how much potential you have, it can all be snuffed out in an instant very easily. What did Alex Riley do after his push in WWE came to a very abrupt end? Well, seeing the writing on the wall, he'd retire from in-ring action and instead take up a role as a color commentator. And outside of a brief return to the ring in 2016, that's the spot he would remain in for the rest of his time in the WWE, with all this meaning there was little to no opportunity for him to ever make a true comeback and become the man it was initially hoped he'd become. But he shouldn't be too upset about this, as, like we said, there was a nice secondary role as a commentator available for him, the same of which can't be said for our next subject, another what-if in the WWE, Monty Brown. Yes, Monty Brown, a man who by all accounts should have been a shoo-in for success during PG-era WWE, as he was everything Vince McMahon was looking for in a star back then. After all, he was a former football player for both the Buffalo Bills and the New England Patriots, was absolutely jacked to the gills, and already had prior experience getting over in the wrestling industry. Where did he get this experience? Well, that would be in TNA, the place where he became a key part of Jeff Jarrett's Planet Jarrett stable for a couple of years in the early 2000s. So with all that being taken into consideration then, it should come as absolutely no surprise that WWE signed him up to a contract in 2006. Unfortunately for Brown though, or to go by the name he had now been given, Marcus Corvon, he wouldn't be given a big push upon debuting with the WWE. No, instead he'd be slotted into the WWECW brand and there left to flounder on a show that few fans watched at the time. And this meant any potential he had to be someone on the level of a top guy was quickly washed away when he became just another member of the New Breed, the group of younger guys looking to take out the ECW originals by any means necessary. Should the alpha male have been moved up to either Raw or SmackDown once WWECW ended and there given a real chance to shine? Absolutely, as at this time WWE were always looking for a new opponent to go against John Cena, and Marcus Corvon certainly had the size and presence to be a legit threat. And even if he was never pushed all the way to the main event, we could certainly see him having at least a mid-card run. Unfortunately though, by that point he was already gone from the company entirely. Yes, it was in 2007 that after family issues caused him to take time away from the ring, Brown would part ways from the WWE forever and would from there announce his permanent retirement from the wrestling world. So it was then that he never got to reach his true potential, and because of that, he'll always go down as a great what-if of wrestling. But then the same could be said about everyone we've looked at today, because they all stand as examples of people who came so close to being who they could have been, but who never managed to make it to that point for one reason or another.